So we know that there are many things that influence curriculum and for our interests influence reading curriculum. We briefly covered some of them in the first 2 weeks when we looked at the historical overview videos and talked a little bit about the timeline of the history of reading. And we spent a little more time this semester on the learning theories and some of the theoretical perspectives that influence our instructional practice. So what we're going to do for the next couple of weeks then is look at the politics of reading. So as reading educators, we know that the politics of education, and in particular the politics and policy making around reading, has real implications for our classroom practice. This is a really complex area of issues and ideas, and for me to distill this into a few classes is really difficult because there's so many specific influences that we can consider even within just the political context itself. And so for this reason, I've chosen to really try to frame this discussion of influence around the larger context of federal and state education policy and the impact that it's had on reading through policy making. Equally important, though, would be a discussion that would follow on implementation, on teachers and teaching, but I think that it really makes sense for our purposes to just start here. Just this discussion could really set the stage for a whole semester on this issue. So here are some important terms that we need to know or that you may or may not be familiar with for the next couple of slides and really for this discussion overall. So ESEA, that's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and that's landmark piece of legislation regarding education in America. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the next couple of slides. Title I, which is was the first section of ESEA, sometimes, or later it was called Chapter 1, and then again it was called Title I, and it was concerned with the education of at-risk students. So IDEA, right, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and again, we're going to discuss in a little bit why this particular piece of legislation is significant for our purposes, for reading. The NICHD, which is the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and in the modern era, they've really become a major player when it comes to reading instruction. And then, of course, the NRP, which is the National Reading Panel, and that's the report that outlines the research that most likely has influenced your practice, and you are probably familiar with it. It obviously has influenced our practice in terms of what we teach in the reading program. So I also gave you this link to the National Right to Read Foundation. It has some interesting resources that will be linked to some of the ideas in the NRP's report, Teaching Children to Read. All right, so let's discuss what we call, or what the field calls, this first generation of reform. So until Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society legislative agenda, there was really little federal involvement in education. So in the mid-1960s, Congress, though, started passing a series of initiatives that would really forever change federal involvement in education. So the passage of Title I of the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act in 1965, and of Head Start. So this legislation, particularly ESEA, was the federal government's first real attempt to influence education policy and practice at the local level. It marked the beginning of the funding of what we call compensatory education programs. So, in other words, we're very familiar with this idea today. It's the practice of supplementing instruction in some way for disadvantaged or at-risk students. In practice, the money and the programming is mostly aimed at reading instruction. So when you talk about at-risk students, usually that's kind of where we go, to reading instruction. And these policies were designed to compensate for the lack of resources found in disadvantaged communities or schools that serve disadvantaged students. And it was really the beginning of the idea to use education and education funding as a tool to level the playing field, which is a phrase that we're pretty familiar with today in education. So what did we get? What was the influence of ESEA, Title I, Head Start, and this new federal involvement in public education? Well, there were some gains in reading. Some would debate that those were pretty negligible. That, for students, their reading scores for students that were participating in Head Start and in some of the Title I funded programs, they did, have some gains in reading, but probably the most significant impact that these policies, that ESEA, Head Start, Title I, had was really that role of the federal government in education, and in particular in the way that money was distributed and programs were developed and monitored, and really, in effect, in terms of local control of education, Title I really changed this significantly. So what it did was it created this separate administrative bureaucracy for schools and districts to have to contend with. The idea of supplemental services, it created these, supplemental and separate programs for the of service for low income and at-risk students. So that really had a significant impact on not only how money flows, but how it was monitored and how and where programs were created. All right, so now let's fast forward a little bit to 1976. So in 1976, we have Public Law 94-142. This is the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, and now it's codified as IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act. What this did was it led to this focus on struggling readers. So this law set up a new category of struggling readers, learning disabled readers. And students who were not responding to those Title I interventions that they had been implementing earlier were now being looked at in different ways. And so what this law did, what Public Law 94-142 did, was it created this category of special education. It entitled disabled children to a free and appropriate education. But unlike the Title I programs, where the students, the interventions for the students were intended to catch the students up, and the students were expected to catch up, we now have this new category of students, the learning disabled, who were assumed to have some kind of physiological or organic disability that impaired reading. And so this is so significant to us as reading educators, because it sets up this new category of readers, right? This category of readers with learning disabilities. And so we know now all the research that would later accompany this and the field of special education itself is set up as an institution. So during this time, numbers of students, I'm sorry. Oh, I started hitting buttons. Sorry about that. The number of students referred to special education really, really skyrockets at this time. The demand for services really increases for special education services. And, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about special education in the context of reading here is because their impact has been so significant. One of the things that's always been a criticism of these laws is that they've always been underfunded. And so what they've done over the course of, the 30 years or so since they were written is really significantly impact the allocation of resources. I think it's estimated that to educate a special education student is about 128% of what it is to educate a general education student. So really significant costs have been incurred by local districts and by states as a result of implementing these laws. And so this is one of the reasons that when they revised IDEA, they included RTI. So that's where RTI, response intervention, comes from. And we know that RTI has significant implications for reading. We don't go too much into it in this class, but you'll do it in some of your other classes. But one of the reasons it becomes attached to this revision is because special ed is so expensive and we have so many students being referred to special ed. So the idea of RTI was really to address this over-identification. But we know that the implementation of RTI itself and then the continuation, if necessary, into special education really has a lot to do with reading and the services and the programs that will be created and students will be provided as a result of these. So I did want to include those because they do, have a lot to do with reading and reading instruction. But let's kind of move on to where we are. So we're in, let's say on a historical timeline, we're in the late 1970s now. So in the meantime, we've had the ESEA compensatory education programs. We're starting to address some special education. But in the meantime, President Carter has elevated the position of the head of the Department of Education to a cabinet level post. And so the education and the federal and government's kind of presumably overextending its role in education is becoming this rallying cry for the Republican Party. So we know the Republican Party is traditionally a party that's focused on decreasing the size of federal government and relinquishing more power to the states. We certainly know, if we're students of history, that Carter is not popular at this time, particularly not with the Republican Party. And in general, there's kind of this new wave of conservatism gaining popularity in the United States as a response to the culture, the social and political culture of the late 1960s and the 70s. So this, what we now have is this conservative movement kind of coming into power with Reagan, and education becomes a significant part of the Reagan campaign. In particular, this idea that the federal government is playing too big of a role in public education. So during his campaign and then when he takes office, kind of his three platforms for education were, first, to abolish the Department of Education as a cabinet post, to promote choice and privatization through tuition tax credits and a system of vouchers, and to restore voluntary prayer in the schools. Kind of not sure where that one came from, but I think it's about the rise of the religious right in conservative politics. It wasn't something that they ever actually did anything about, but we can talk about the first two. So I'm actually going to stop us because we're at 14 minutes. So in screencast 2, we'll pick up on this discussion of kind of where the 1980s takes reading and reading instruction.